Good morning, everyone. This is Ted Bauman, editor of the Bauman Letter, with what is normally your Friday Bauman Daily video, but today we're releasing it on Monday, thanks to the 4th of July holiday. Now, I've had a number of requests to share my guitar collection since a couple of you noticed that I had an amplifier in the background. Yes, that was an orange Micro Terror, but no, that was not a PV Classic. That is the remnants of an old Fender Blues DeVille that I cut up and made into a speaker after the amp died. Here's my first guitar I'm going to show you. This is a Paul Reed Smith. It is one that I've had for some time. It's one that I really love when I'm trying to crack that Jeff Beck sound. Remember Jeff Beck when he played back with Rod Stewart back in the days, the first Jeff Beck group. It was one of my favorite iterations of rock and roll music. Anyway, so that's it for this week. Next week, you'll meet one of my next guitars. This week, I want to talk about the job situation. Obviously, on Thursday, we saw a very nice jump in the job hiring rate. 4.8 million jobs were added to the rolls. There were 1.43 million new unemployment claims, which was down 55,000 from the week before. The number of people continuing to claim regular unemployment benefits, on the other hand, rose to 19.29 million. So we still have about 20 million people unemployed. Now, one of the things to remember about that jobs report is that it was released based on data up to the middle of June, before the big turnaround in COVID cases that we began to see around that time. Now, some of the other indicators that we're looking at are things like auto sales. They have fallen off in the last couple of weeks. Data from things like cell phone movement tracking show a decline in small business activity, increasing closures of retail stores, and so on. So we're not out of the woods yet, and I think it's fair to say that we're in the same situation we've always been. We're hostage to the virus. Now, obviously, the stock market reacted positively to that news, as it did the month before. I am perfectly happy to admit that I underestimated the extent of the stock market's ability to be resilient in the face of this. However, I continue to maintain that until all the data is in, and until we know what is the likely course of the pandemic here in the United States, we could still see a significant pullback. And I'm certainly not the only one calling for that. For those of you who'd like to gloat and say that I missed the mark, maybe I have, and I'm free to admit it. However, I still don't think we're out of the woods. I still think that it is prudent to take profits and to make sure that you don't get yourself in a situation where those gains could be wiped out overnight as a result of some sort of catastrophic news, which still could happen. We haven't seen GDP figures yet. Today, I want to talk about how the pandemic has affected the retail sector, and particularly the importance of stimulus and what will happen likely if we don't get stimulus. I'm going to show you a couple of graphs. The first one shows how the pandemic has hit the retail sector. You can see that the overall impact on retail is not so big, but it's this discretionary stuff, the furniture, the electronics and appliances, closing stores, restaurants and bars, the second biggest one after clothing, but also gas stations because people are not traveling. People are working in their gardens and on their homes. They're drinking a lot of booze and they are shopping a lot online. And that helps to offset the overall decline in retail, which is still 10%. That's still a lot. Now let's look at a chart that shows the change in the number of U.S. small business employees from what the baseline before COVID hit. We're still at 24% unemployment in the small business sector compared to where we were. So that's 24%, almost a quarter of American small business employees who were spending money from a job that they had who are no longer able to do that and are dependent on unemployment and also on the additional unemployment top-up of $600 a month thanks to the CARES Act. Now, this is how the CARES Act, this next chart shows how the safety net has helped to basically maintain income throughout the economy and also therefore spending and economic activity. You can see that this is a chart that shows income increasing over time, and then it shows the big dip in 2020 But then you see that jag back up on the right. That is the impact of fiscal stimulus. Now, we've been talking a lot about fiscal stimulus, or rather monetary policy recently. We've been talking a lot about how the Fed's actions have goosed the stock market, and that is certainly true. The mechanisms by which it has done that are often difficult to discern, but probably the most important one is by supporting corporate debt markets and preventing companies from facing the inevitable results of a decline that we've seen, what I just showed you in sales, and that would have been bankruptcy and things like that. Also, companies unable to roll over their debt. So the Fed has helped in that way. I still maintain that the Fed has also helped to boost overall liquidity by helping money get into the hands of investors who might want to invest using margin and that sorts of thing. So that has helped as well. But the key thing is sentiment, and that's what the Fed has done. But there's another aspect, and that is that stimulus that I just showed you. It brought incomes for ordinary Americans back up to levels right where they had been, but only thanks to the government. Now let's look at the specific ways that the fiscal stimulus has operated. You can see at the top that the number one amount of money paid out under the CARES Act went to corporations. If you strip out airlines at the bottom and other transportation sectors, what you see is that companies who were in desperate straits and wanted to borrow money from the federal facility did so. That's not the same as small business loans like the Paycheck Protection Act, but that was the second biggest feature. So the small business loans are mainly the money that was given to small businesses or lent to them on the condition that they continue to employ their people throughout the crisis. And if they do that, they don't have to pay the money back. The next biggest chunk, household payments, which is the stimulus checks that many of us got. Then unemployment insurance, and that's a big one because that reflects the federal top-up of $600 a month and also support to the states to enable them to maintain employment insurance. So if you take all those fiscal flows going into the real economy, here's the result. The next chart shows the M1 money supply having increased dramatically. That basically means that whereas most people end up having their money in a bank or in some sort of situation where they're spending it very quickly, all this money flooded out. It's gone into bank accounts, particularly in the corporate sector and the small business sector. It's sitting in those bank accounts as a guard against further downturn. Now, the importance of fiscal stimulus can be seen in how it impacts recovery from recession. I want to show you a next chart that shows that. This one shows how long it normally takes, or historically how long it has taken for jobs and the level of employment to recover after a recession. And if you notice, there is a distinct pattern. The further back you go, generally, the shorter the time period it takes for us to recover from recession. And the reason for that is simple. Back in the 50s and 60s, 70s, right up into the 80s, the government was guided by Keynesian policy framework, which said, as I've explained previously, that the goal is to use government spending to make up for a gap in GDP. And because they agreed and they understood and everybody accepted that, even the Republicans, Congress was fairly quick to authorize spending to boost the economy back up. Starting in the 1980s, on the other hand, we began to see a different scenario. We began to see that the length of time that it takes for jobs to recover began to stretch out. 1990, we can see it's up to around 3 years. 2001, up to 4 years. The 2007 downturn really, we never really got back up to our previous employment until about 6 years later. But even then, remember, this only measures the number of employees, not the number of people who could be working, who are working. So the message is pretty straightforward here. If the government reacts with stimulus quickly and maintains it, then the economy recovers quickly. The next chart shows that in terms of the contribution of fiscal stimulus to GDP. Now, as you can see, after the dot-com bust in the early 2000s, we did see a pretty big uptick in stimulus, and it stretched out long enough to tip the economy into positive GDP. Later on in that decade, taxation and reduced spending led to a subtraction from GDP, which is normal because you need to pay back what you've spent under the current monetary regime. Then you see after 2007, you see a big boost of spending, but it declines very quickly. And in fact, by 2010, it turns negative. That, my friends, is why we saw that long, drawn-out 6-year period before employment turned to normal. Now let's move forward. We can see that under the current circumstances, the government has spent a huge amount of money in the first 2 quarters. But based on current projections, if it does not continue to maintain stimulus at the level that it has in the past, this is where we're headed. You can see those red lines. We are headed for disaster. Now, the reason why I'm raising all this today is because I just want to bring your attention to the fact that fiscal stimulus has played this role. I believe that I've underestimated its impact in terms of boosting the economy, and of course that feeds through to the stock market as well. But I think the critical question is what happens next. And here's where the problem lies. The Senate leadership under Mitch McConnell has said that they are not interested in extending the $600 unemployment premium because they're concerned that it discourages people from going back to work. The White House says the same thing. There is talk about putting out another stimulus payment, but that stimulus payment, of course, it has not been decided, nor has it been passed. And the problem is that Congress only has an 11-day window later this month to pass that stimulus before they go on recess. If they don't do it during that 11-day window, if Democrats, Republicans, and the White House cannot agree on stimulus, there won't be any. Now, here's where the politics of it comes in. We have an election coming up. The Republicans in the White House and in the Senate seem to be not on the same page, really, about whether stimulus is needed, what kind of stimulus is needed. And every time the economy begins to appear to recover, like it did last Thursday with the jobs figure, then the impetus for further stimulus declines. The problem is that the economy is recovering because of stimulus. If you take the stimulus away, then you're going to get a scenario like we saw after 2007, which is that jobs are going to take a long time to recover, and that in turn will impact GDP. It will remain lower than it was otherwise. And that in turn will feed back to the kinds of stocks that a lot of us have invested in heavily, things like airlines, hotels, etc., trying to capture value and mispricing. If people don't have money to spend, they won't be using those things, and they won't be buying discretionary goods either. So the key question here is the government, which is obviously divided between Republicans and Democrats, willing and able to extend stimulus? My prediction is that if they don't, then we're going to see a significant decline in economic activity in the second half of the year. Now that raises another political issue. What are the incentives for the various players here? The Republicans, I think, are in two minds. On one hand, they want to claim credit for having the economy recover. But on the other hand, if they keep talking about the recovery and how rapidly and well it's going, then the argument for another round of stimulus gets weaker, and many members of the Republican caucus will be reluctant to vote for another round of it, which will in turn become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It will make the amount of money available for stimulus far less than it would be, if anything at all. Then you have the Democrats, and the problem with the Democrats, of course, is that with an election coming, they have a perverse incentive actually to pitch a level of support, a stimulus that they know the Republicans won't accept, so they can blame the Republicans for blocking it in the hopes of helping Joe Biden get elected president. So all in all, the situation, to my mind, is very, very difficult, and I think it's important for everyone to bear in mind that in this situation, uncertainty rules. We have sentiment driving the market. The underlying numbers are still not good. The employment rate, yes, it is increasing, but it's increasing mainly in the form of people returning to jobs in places like bars and restaurants, which are unfortunately again closing. So not trying to be pessimistic, I'm just trying to put out the facts here. In our most recent Bauman letter picks, we have reflected this by looking for deep value in the form of companies that are seriously mispriced, in the sense that they are being tarred with the same brush as other companies that may seem related to them but aren't. So, for example, we're looking for retail companies, retail parts of the retail sector that are actually essential, but a lot of investors assume that they aren't, and so they're not buying them. That's what we're buying. That's our strategy at the moment. So I would encourage you to think in those terms. Look for deep value, take your profits. Be careful if you speculate. I do still think that we're going to see a dip. I don't think it'll necessarily go down to the levels of March, but when we see those GDP numbers later this month, then I think we're going to see some fireworks. Anyway, this is me signing off. I hope you had a good weekend. Remember that you can subscribe to the Bauman Letter by clicking on the link up above in the left. And I'll be back next week with another one of my guitars. Take care. Bye-bye.